Sicil's reputation for taking on challenges and never backing down was well known among her classmates. At just 10 years old, she had already outwitted most of the boys in her class, especially after the science experiment debacle, where she messed with their chemicals to ensure her salt analysis was completed first, left some of the boys fuming with embarrassment. Now, they were determined to teach her a lesson she wouldn't forget. It was a hot afternoon, the sun beating down as Sicil strolled toward the old playground with her friend Ruby. A group of boys lingered nearby, huddled together and whispering, casting furtive glances her way. Among them, Dean, the ringleader, had his arms crossed, an unmistakable smirk playing on his lips. He had been plotting since the science lab incident, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. As Sicil and Ruby approached, Dean stepped forward, his voice dripping with faux sweetness. "Hey, Sicil. You have excelled at pretending to be the bravest kid in class, finishing first by messing up our salts," he said, leaning casually against a tree. His friends chuckled behind him, egging him on. Sicil raised an eyebrow, sensing the challenge in his tone. "You sound like a sour loser, Dean," she replied with a defiant smile, crossing her arms. Ruby tugged at her sleeve nervously, already wary of where this was headed. Dean exchanged a glance with his friends, his smirk widening. "Oh, not at all. Just wondering if you're up for a real challenge this time. Something bigger than those silly classroom experiments." Sicil's interest was piqued. She never turned down a challenge, and the glint in her eyes told Dean he had her attention. "What's the dare?" she asked, stepping closer, her heart already racing with excitement. Dean pointed toward the edge of the school's property, where the dilapidated old building sat, half hidden behind thick trees. The abandoned structure had been there for years, decaying and forgotten, its windows dark and its roof sagging under the weight of time. Stories about the place floated around the school, most claiming it was dangerous, even haunted. "You go in there, explore the whole thing," Dean said, his voice lowering into a serious tone. "Go up to the second floor, then come back and tell us what you saw." The other boys snickered. They knew the place was far more dangerous than Sicil could imagine, but that was the point. They wanted to scare her and teach her a lesson after she had humiliated them in the lab. Sicil glanced toward the building, her pulse quickening at the sight of its ominous, crumbling facade. But she wasn't about to let a group of boys intimidate her. Her reputation as the class daredevil was on the line. "Easy," she said, squaring her shoulders. "I'll be back before you even start missing me." One of the boys, Ronnie, chimed in with a sly grin. "Sure about that. The last time someone tried to go in, they didn't come back until the next morning. Said they got lost. And some say the floorboards aren't stable. You wouldn't want to end up in the basement, would you?" Ruby tugged at Sicil's arm harder this time, her face pale. "Sicil, this isn't like the usual dares. It's dangerous. Please, don't go." But Sicil, eyes glinting with determination, shook her off. "Don't worry, Ruby, it's just a building. I've got this." With that, she turned her back on the boys and marched toward the structure, ignoring Ruby's protests. As she approached the building, the temperature seemed to drop, the air growing thicker and heavier. The windows were broken, some hanging from rusted hinges, and the front door creaked as she pushed it open. The inside was even worse than she'd expected. Dark, damp, and filled with the scent of rot. The floorboards groaned under her weight, and each step echoed ominously in the empty space. The boys watched from a distance, their laughter fading as Sicil disappeared inside. Dean's smirk faltered slightly as the silence swallowed her up. "Think she'll actually make it?" one of the boys muttered. "If she does, we've got to come up with something bigger," Dean replied, though a twinge of doubt now crept into his voice. Inside the building, Sicil moved cautiously, her heart beating fast in her chest. The walls were covered in grime, the wallpaper peeled into long strips, and the floor was littered with debris. She reached the staircase leading to the second floor and hesitated for a moment, the wooden steps looking like they hadn't been touched in decades. But Sicil wasn't one to back down. Gritting her teeth, she ascended the stairs, her movements careful but determined. Halfway up, the creaking grew louder, and she could feel the floor beneath her feet shifting. She froze, holding her breath, but the silence was deafening. After what felt like an eternity, she made it to the top. Meanwhile, outside the building, Ruby couldn't stand still any longer. She knew something was wrong, and her gut told her that Sicil was in danger. Racing to the PE fields, knowing she would find Sebastian there at this time, finishing up his class. Breathless and frantic, she grabbed his arm. "Sebastian! It's Sicil! She's in the abandoned building! The boys dared her to go in, and I think something's going to happen," Ruby blurted out, her voice laced with panic. Sebastian's heart dropped. He knew Sicil had a reckless side, but this wasn't just a harmless prank. He didn't waste a second. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice sharp with urgency. Ruby pointed toward the woods, and Sebastian sprinted across the school grounds, his heart hammering in his chest. Ruby struggled to keep up as she led him to the old, crumbling structure at the edge of the woods. Sebastian's mind raced, replaying every reckless thing Sicil had done before. But this was different. This was a real danger. He burst through the entrance of the building, the door hanging off its rusty hinges, and the eerie silence inside sent a chill down his spine. He could hear the faint sound of creaking wood and Sicil's voice calling out to herself in the distance. "Hello? Anyone here?" "Sicil!" Sebastian's voice echoed through the dark, dusty corridors, his breath quickening with each step. He searched frantically, throwing open doors to abandoned classrooms, each one more decayed than the last. Broken desks, shattered windows, and peeling wallpaper loomed like ghostly reminders of the building's forgotten past. Every empty room only deepened his fear. He could feel the floor shifting beneath his feet as he moved deeper into the building, his gut churning with worry. He reached a dead-end hallway where the stairs creaked ominously above. He couldn't hear Sicil, couldn't see her, and panic started to creep into his thoughts. What if she'd fallen? What if she was hurt? He couldn't let his mind go there. Just then, the sound of splintering wood and a muffled yelp cut through the thick silence. His heart leapt in his chest. "Sicil!" he shouted, racing toward the noise. He rounded a corner and bounded up the dilapidated staircase 2 steps at a time, the floor groaning under his weight. His pulse roared in his ears as he followed the sound of her voice. When he reached the landing, his heart nearly stopped. There was Sicil, on the stairs where the floor beneath her had begun to give way. She let out a startled yelp as the boards cracked, and before she could react, the floor crumbled beneath her feet. Her arms grabbed onto the railing just in time to stop her fall. But the railing too began to break under her weight. Sebastian's eyes were wide with fear as they both spotted each other. "Seb!" she called, her voice shaky but defiant, still clutching the crumbling wood with one hand. She was struggling to hold tight. Without thinking, Sebastian lunged forward, grabbing her arms just as the railing gave way beneath her. He yanked her to safety, both of them collapsing onto the hard floor as debris rained down around them. His arms wrapped tightly around her, and for a moment, they just sat there, breathing heavily, trying to process how close she had come to disaster. "Are you insane?" Sebastian gasped, his voice breaking with a mixture of relief and anger. "You could have died, Sicil. This isn't some dumb classroom dare." Sicil, still catching her breath, tried to brush it off with a weak grin. "I had it under control. You're always worrying for no reason, Seb." But her voice wavered, and she couldn't quite meet his eyes. Sebastian wasn't buying it this time. He grabbed her shoulders and stared her down, his expression dead serious. "No, Sicil, this was different. This was real. You could have fallen through that floor and I wouldn't have been able to reach you in time." His voice cracked slightly at the end, the weight of what had almost happened settling over them both. Sicil, seeing the fear in his eyes, conceited. The fear that had driven him to search every inch of that broken-down building for her. The fear that made him race in like a storm just to save her. She swallowed hard and said, "I'm sorry, Seb. I didn't realize." Together, they stood up, Sebastian keeping a firm grip on her arm as they navigated their way back through the labyrinth of hallways. The danger they had just escaped was a cold reminder of how real things could get, and for once, Sicil wasn't brushing it off. As they stepped out into the sunlight, leaving the old building behind, a group of boys, including Dean, stood waiting. Dean's smug grin faded slightly when he saw Sicil emerge unscathed, with Sebastian's protective arm around her. But he wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. "Well, see who needed a savior to complete her dare," Dean sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Guess you're not as brave as you think, huh, Sicil? Maybe next time you'll think twice before messing with us." Sebastian's eyes narrowed, a flash of anger igniting inside him. He took a step toward Dean, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "You're done with these stupid dares, Dean. If you ever pull something like this again, you'll answer me," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. Dean straightened up, trying to keep his cool in front of his friends, but Sebastian's tone had shaken him. He wasn't expecting this level of seriousness from someone usually so calm. Dean opened his mouth to retort, but before he could say anything, the other boys, seeing how close things had come to real danger, began to murmur behind him. "Maybe we should back off, Dean," one of the boys whispered nervously. "We don't want any real trouble. We'll find another way to deal with her later." Dean hesitated, his gaze flickering between Sebastian's fiery stare and the supportive murmurings from his friends. For a moment it seemed like he might double down, but then he just grunted, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Whatever," he muttered, trying to maintain his bravado as he turned away. "This isn't over." As Dean and his group backed down, Ruby rushed up to Sicil and Sebastian, her face flushed with relief and anger. "I can't believe them! They could have gotten you killed, Sicil!" she exclaimed, glaring at the retreating boys. Sicil, trying to play it cool, shrugged. "I guess I owe Seb more than a thank you this time." She turned to him, her eyes softening with genuine gratitude. "I really didn't think it was that serious." Sebastian sighed, shaking his head. "You never do, Sicil. But what if I am not always there to pull you out?" For the first time, Sicil realized just how much she had relied on Sebastian, how even when she didn't see the danger, he was always there, protecting her in ways she hadn't fully understood. She squeezed his hand. "I know," she whispered, a smile tugging at her lips. "And next time, I'll think twice." Sebastian nodded, but deep down, he knew there would always be a next time with Sicil. And no matter how reckless she was, he'd always be there to keep her safe, even if she never quite understood the gravity of the situations she got herself into.